Get ready to be inspired by the great things happening in rural education. The Rural Scoop will bring you new ideas and innovative solutions. We'll dive into education issues and we'll highlight what's working in your rural communities. You'll hear from a variety of educators, administrators, professionals, and others who will provide relevant and engaging content in each episode. And now, serving up the scoop, here's your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf.
Well, welcome back to the Rural Scoop, where we talk plain sense about leading in rural places and share practices that you can use on Monday morning. I'm your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf, and today I'm joined by Alyssa Hanrahan, principal in the Chattooga County Schools in Georgia. And we're doing a deep dive on school safety that goes beyond hardware and handbooks. We're going to be talking about daily culture work that includes emotional intelligence and clear routines and calm communication and how to run a plan that holds you on your worst day. Alyssa's bringing field-tested strategies for drills without fear, threat assessment that actually helps kids, and partnerships that work when resources are thin. So if you lead in a rural place or you love someone who does, this one's for you. So let's get to it. So Alyssa, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate you spending some time.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I want to start with the ground truth, and that is, what did leadership, resilience, and crisis response in rural schools, when did that become your lane?
That's a great question. My first assistant principal position was in a rural district where I had been a teacher for 11 years. And as we all know, in rural districts, we wear a variety of hats, particularly at the school level and at the district level too. Those first 2 years as an assistant principal, I learned a lot. And I was fascinated by my principal's ability to compartmentalize things effectively, to implement systems and processes, but also her ability to stay calm in some very trying situations. So it began there because the bulk of my career as an educator was in a rural community. And then later, when I worked at the Department of Education with the Rural Education and Innovation team as their partnership specialist, we interviewed rural educators on burnout. And when we were going to various districts to interview teachers, specifically rural teachers, about their experiences with burnout, I had superintendents pull me to the side and say, you really should dig a little deeper about superintendents and burnout. And how and some of them shared with me some of the negative coping strategies they employed just to get through COVID. So it was there. And then I've always been fascinated by people's ability to employ good self-regulation and coping and emotional intelligence in dealing with people in particularly rural settings, but just school leaders of any kind. It's fascinating to me because I've seen people that do it well. And of course, I've seen people that don't. So that was the path my mind took to get me to the research that I did earlier this year.
So if you had to put your personal safety philosophy in one sentence, if you had a brand new teacher at your building, what would that be?
Yeah, relationships are everything. They are really, really everything. Like if you build good boundaried relationships with boys and girls, they will tell you when things aren't safe. They will let you know if you have good boundaried relationships with your colleagues and your leaders and with your parents. They're almost like they'll be the best litmus test to let you know when something's not right. But most especially children.
Yeah, very true. And so you've talked to a lot of people that really shape that belief, that philosophy, that relationships are the foundation of everything. I want to pull those together. When you did your interviews and your conversations, what were the themes that rose to the top about what actually works in school safety, especially if you're in a rural context? And also, can you speak to what surprised you and maybe what confirmed your instincts about what you might find?
Sure. So when I worked for the Rural Education and Innovation team, and I failed to mention this, I wrote the first school safety grant for rural districts after Uvalde. And to prepare for creating that grant, I attended sessions and learned a lot about school shootings and what went wrong. And one underlying theme was that the law enforcement and school districts and first responders, there was broken relationship, which led to failed communication, which led to not responding to crisis effectively. And of course, we know people died. So relationships came up, on having clear processes and procedures and practicing them. Just because we have a safety plan doesn't mean that it works effectively. You really have to, I keep saying processes and procedures, but you have to create a plan and then you have to run it to troubleshoot. And some people talked a lot about their faith, and they also talked about self-control. That came up over and over again. There were two things that were very interesting to me. One person shared that they thought that it was selfish to immediately act in their own emotion, almost to indulge in reactivity because you weren't putting your people first. And then another person said that he talked about how Patton, during World War II, he had this notoriously explosive temper and, he was abusive to his troops. And it delayed the end of the World War II, some historians say, by 6 months to a year because of his lack of emotional intelligence. So that was, those type of findings were surprising to me, but also surprising to me were the humanity and people's responses, in communities. And even me, I interviewed people superintendents that I greatly admire, and they talked a lot about the hard decisions and almost like, as they were sharing about controversies and clear communication they had to employ to navigate a shooting, even COVID, how traumatic that was, but how they had to keep things stuck down. They got very emotional when they talked about the impact of that on their own families. One person even said, you should do an interview on the spouses of leaders and how they're impacted by the things that leaders go through on any given day. So that was surprising to me for sure.
When you take a look at those themes, is there a theme that you could say, okay, a leader in a building right now, they should be thinking about this and acting on it maybe like tomorrow, this month, and one that maybe needs a longer runway for them to think about how they might want to deploy or stand up a response to that kind of issue?
Well, I'm a new principal and I'm new to the community here. And in this role, I have done something because one of my core values is collaboration and relationship, but also empowerment. And I realize if we want to have a safe school, we have to, outside of processes and procedures, we have to empower people to help us keep it safe. And we can only do that effectively if we have relationship capital. One thing that I have done is we did drills. We actually, when school started, we did, okay, where's your duty? Let's run a school-wide fire drill. Let's do lunch duty. Let's do dismissal. Let's do arrival. So that, because those are the gaps in supervision sometimes that's when someone can get in your building and you don't realize it. Or if you don't stage that properly beforehand, you won't realize oh, wow, we have a gap in supervision over here on this bus ramp. And, some of my schools in a rural community were at the top of the hill, one way in and one way out, which is, but we have to carefully plan for those things. So my advice to leaders would be to actually run those drills, but do pulse checks with your people. And it's not comfortable. Doing a quarterly survey in December with teachers, you are going to get some pointed answers. But if we can put our feelings aside, you also get really, really good feedback. And I think it's important for leaders to get out and have those 30-second conversations, pulse checks with your people, go to lunch duty, pop your head down and talk to folks on planning, just go in their classroom. You got to be in your building to kind of know the vibe and be out and about, but also use formal and informal ways to build relationships and get feedback. And an informal thing I've been doing is that quarterly survey. And it's a basic SWOT analysis, like what's working, what are some strengths, what are some weaknesses, what are opportunities, what are threats? And then I have an open-ended, do you have any suggestions or solutions? And they'll tell you, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that. those couple of things with drills and getting feedback formally and informally, I would say those things could be employed immediately.
That's great. I want to zoom into the realities that make rural safety its own skill set for sure. So talk a little bit about, Alyssa, your experience with what safety or crisis challenges show up in rural schools that really aren't as common in urban or suburban systems, whether it's distance or staffing, those kinds of things. What are you seeing?
I was just telling a superintendent friend of mine, what happened to children's mental health since 2019 when I was in a building last time? And so in our communities, like most rural communities, we have very limited accessibility to mental health services. We are on the brink of getting some telehealth services. My superintendent has been innovative with her funding on how to access different other avenues of mental health supports. But when a child is a threat to themselves or others in, suburban and urban districts, you have a plethora of numbers and resources you can plug them into. And it's, in our rural communities, that's definitely a challenge. And I would also say some of the, and you said about funding, I guess the limitations with some staffing, like when I've worked in bigger districts, it's the behavior specialists. Right now we all have seen an uptick in kids' disruptive behaviors for a lot of different reasons. But I would say a threat to safety and maybe somewhat is the accessibility to resources and supports to help teachers really navigate some significant challenging behaviors. It's limited. We make the best of it, but that could be very taxing on teacher morale for sure.
Yeah. What have you done to address that? What has changed as a result of those things being barriers or issues that you've had to plan around?
Well, we have tried to equip our teachers. I've heard us and other districts with some behavior training, like refreshers, and help us really check our own trauma at the door. Sometimes we don't realize how our own, when we are dysregulated, we can't regulate a child. So we're really trying to equip teachers with some of those preventative things they can do to address, behaviors, but also help them be aware, like, this is what children say when they're having suicide ideations. This is a threat you need to take seriously, which versus a threat that's just somebody playing around. And really helping them know the markers of mental health. I've also worked with our staff, our classified staff. I've gone to them just actually in the past 2 weeks and said, look, sometimes the winter and the holidays are really hard for people. You all see everybody, like my custodians, my front office staff, my cafeteria. Yeah. Please let me know if somebody is not themselves or they're down, because we want to make sure we can support them.
Yeah, such important things to be aware of. And really low level. I mean, it's easy to implement that tomorrow.
Okay.
So knowing the terrain is obviously step one, and understanding where your issues are. But building systems that fit your context with those things in mind, really, I think, is step two. So can you walk us through how either your district now or how you have seen other districts address those challenges? What are the anchors, like your threat assessment plans or your internal comms plans? And how do you see teachers and leaders making sure that they are keeping it simple enough that they're able to run it under stress?
Oh, yeah, that's great. That's a really good point. Teachers notify us if they have a concern about a student who's a threat to themselves or others. I was in a position when I started to hire a non-traditional school counselor. She's actually finishing up her clinical license as a child therapist. And so I was able to bring her on board. And so she does the threat assessment, and we have like a cadre of people that support that, because we want to have mental health professionals be a part of that. But we also, the administrator sits in, let me say this, the administrator sits in while the counselor does the threat assessment. But then we have a cadre of people, a team, if you will, talk through and decide how to best support the student moving forward. And I think it's important that we have differing perspectives. Like we have the SRO, but we also have the counselor. We also have an administrator. We have the district social worker, and everybody's kind of plugged into their own network of how to support this child. And we've been able to do some really good problem solving around that because we're a small community. Mm-hmm. So while that's a challenge, the relationships here, again, with the relationships, those people with all their different levels of expertise on the team and their different networks of support, we're able to immediately take what we can do as a team and support the child, through a crisis. I think that's the beauty of rural districts for sure.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what's been the most challenging part of your plan to implement or to train on, or just to make sure that it's running smoothly?
I think just making sure that I have a clear understanding of who needs to be at the table at what part of the process. Like, when do we bring in the team? And so we bring in the team after the assessment is made to determine if we need to move forward with it. And then when the child reintegrates back to school, like if they've had to go to a facility, that team meets again. Or even if the child we don't deem that the child has to get help outside of our school, we meet again as the team to determine what can we do within the four walls to support that kid. Mm-hmm. So for me, just learning who to bring in when and who needed to be on that team. But now that I have an understanding of that, it's been a blessing, quite honestly, because everybody has their own lens on how to problem solve and their own network of solutions.
Yeah, good point. You mentioned that COVID was kind of a turning point for it, especially when it comes to being aware of mental health with our students. And I want to ask you, and you can speak from either your school perspective now or from the interviews that you were able to conduct about a couple of years ago around these concerns. If you ask teachers what's different now than it was, say, 5 years ago, what kinds of things would they talk about?
I think the safety, and see, and I can speak to that too, because I was a district and state person. I was a district person when COVID happened, and then I was state, and I went back to district. So I can tell you that safety is the lens through which we run everything. And there's a greater emphasis on making sure that the hard facility is secure, but also a heightened awareness around, like I was saying, mental health. And in terms of the children, it seemed that maybe some of their emotional resilience and some of that is due to other things, that may impact mental health, like technology, for instance, screen time. But just the children, we've had to spend some time really teaching emotional regulation, like we teach numeracy and literacy, like, getting kids to learn how to think about situations, learning how to repair relationships, navigate conflict, and really skills to, like, I hear teachers talking about how they talk to children about how to calm down. So those are some things, when I started as a teacher, I wasn't teaching kids how to cope or how to breathe or how to write or take a time out. I was teaching social studies, and that I wasn't responsible for anything. And now there's really a focus on the whole child, and there's a greater awareness of how trauma and outside issues impact learning. And I feel that the education field, at least in my state, has responded accordingly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The tools and the plans that you have, those absolutely matter, but the tone that you set as a leader often matters more. And Alyssa, you've talked a lot about this. Your presentation really does center on self-awareness and empathy and relationship management. You've talked about relationships and the importance of those. But can you talk also about where you've seen emotional intelligence change outcomes, not just feelings, but that emotional intelligence as a safety lever?
Sure. I think that sometimes that emotional intelligence, the reactivity, I've seen and heard teachers really, and any staff, like employing that pause. And when they know things are contentious in a meeting or over the phone, just to take a minute. And also, one thing that we've worked on, at least with people I've worked with, is, we do a lot of texting now, and sometimes things can get off the rails on a text message. So really imploring to people to call and have a phone call, or even better, a FaceTime meeting to build those relationships. I think that's really important. But I think like communication has gotten really big. Teachers really try to, like when I first started teaching, I know this is funny, we sent notes home on carbon paper. I kept a copy and I sent one home.
I remember those days.
But now, there's so many platforms. Teachers are on Facebook and they're on their phone, and they might have a class website and they have Remind. And it's trying to stay on top of all these modes of communication to stay connected and make sure parents have an awareness about what's going on in the building. I think really understanding that we have to communicate with clarity to decrease parents' anxiety about school because of the things that have happened in schools. That's definitely been a change.
Yeah. What you mentioned, adults needing to be regulated so that they can help their students regulate themselves. So what routines do you use as a leader to keep the adults in your building regulated so that kids can regulate? Or what with the interviews that you were doing, do the adults do to do the same?
They talked a lot about flexibility, I think, and then communicating clearly, but making sure you have follow-up communication frequently, giving people updates. But they talked a lot about flexibility and knowing that like the best laid plans, you got to have plan B, you got to have plan C. And also like when you're collecting information around a crisis, not to have the knee-jerk decision, reaction or statement based on only one data point. And of course, sometimes in the moment, you've got to take what's right there because you have to respond immediately. But a lot of them talked about kind of slow rolling things and making sure that people were updated, that there was clarity. And then when people are afraid, recognizing that, like not acting in panic as a leader, but recognizing the emotions that come up when there is a crisis. They talked a lot about that also.
Yeah. People obviously need supports, and rural places often don't have enough of them. So it is something that when you look to fill the gap, partnerships can become a strategy. And it is something that I've seen, I know you've seen too. When those things are working well, you can build a safety net. For example, when you have mental health services and external supports are scarce, and that might mean a difference in terms of what you're able to offer your students. So what are those partnerships that you've either stood up at Chattooga or that you, when you were doing your interviews, were able to find out about with the people that you spoke to? What partnerships have been difference makers for those students? And how do you make sure that you keep them warm between incidents? Because it's not always that you need them. So talk a little bit about the cadence for making sure that those relationships are solid.
Well, I think I'll talk first about some innovative solutions. Like superintendents have had to be very creative. And when I worked at the state, I saw superintendents really in rural areas utilize that the COVID money for very innovative solutions. Like one school district partnered with a college that was, probably 2 hours away, and the clinical counseling students who were finishing up their master's degree did their clinical hours via telehealth with the students in a very rural, very needy district, probably one of the poorest in the state. And it provided accessibility. The other thing is in some other districts, they were able to bring in like the school-based health centers. That has been a big push, particularly in our rural communities. And they were able to develop partnerships with local hospitals, local clinicians to bring them into those school-based health centers to offer those services to families whose, the parent does shift work, and it's a real encumbrance to the family if the parent has to leave for an appointment, Those were things that I saw that were really innovative. And you talked about like the keeping up the cadence of support. And I'll go back to the classroom teacher, just checking in. I always tell the teachers, just checking in with kids, ask them how their weekend is, talking about their dog. If you do that with each kid, at least over a 2-day period, because, some people teach multiple classes, but if you just do that one little question and you make it a goal to talk to every kid that you teach, regularly, whenever that looks like to you, daily, over 2 days, even weekly, that's the support you need. Acknowledging, acknowledging that you know about their life and you ask about their life. That gives a sense of belonging and validation. And that helps kids come to school and they feel that, hey, someone misses me when I'm gone, or somebody cares about my hobby outside of school. Mm-hmm. So I think, but with the counseling piece, I think the school counselor is instrumental in checking in between, the formal clinical appointments, and then the classroom teacher, of course, just offering that support, being that buffer, and being somebody who cares and makes somebody feel a part of the school.
So since you stepped into this role at Chattooga as the principal, can you talk a little bit about how your understanding of emotional intelligence has evolved, especially for safety and crisis management, because I'm sure that it has?
You can give all these presentations and you can do all the research. But I realize I set the tone for the building, and I have had to really be mindful of how I start my day, to not start harried. And I have to be mindful of every piece of communication that I have, even my body language. It's like a ripple effect over 800 children and 110 adults. And I have to be okay to ask for feedback. And I have been asking, I'm at the point in my year right now, I asked for feedback in October, and I've been going around and asking teachers, how can I empower you? And I have to be okay enough and emotionally intelligent enough to take my ego and my feelings out of the equation when I read the responses, because I know I have no question everybody in my building is here for the right reason. They love these children and their responses come from a good place. So I think knowing in my mind, I think as leaders, we're always, parents will drag you through the mud on social media. You get a lot of, you're constantly scrutinized by everybody, top, bottom, outside, all the time. But knowing when you go to your staff and they give you feedback, really lowering your defenses and allowing yourself to marinate in that a little bit. And then act on it with intentionality, but get those multiple data points. Don't go with the first story. Make sure you're asking and looking and observing before you act on any feedback. But like I said, that slow roll, I've learned, if I want to find something out, usually the best answer is I will arrive at that over several days. It won't be like a snap thing, if that makes sense. Like me asking teachers, how can I empower you? The best feedback that I can get will take place over this week and next week. And then I'll have time over Thanksgiving holiday to marinate on it and talk about with them how we can move forward using their feedback to make the school better.
Mm. And can you talk a little bit about that, Alyssa, as far as, the building is safer when adults show up calmer and clearer. So how does that fit into your overall safety plan?
Well, I have to model what I expect. And I will admit to you that I don't always model that. I'm a hard charger and I am fiercely driven by my core values. And sometimes that causes me to work beyond what is healthy. And I have to be I picked up roller skating, and I'm telling everybody in the building, this 47-year-old woman is roller skating in her neighborhood. Because I want them to remember the joy. And I had somebody recently remind me, go and find a place in your building every day that ignites your joy. And so I have a kindergarten classroom here that's a mix. It smells like Lucky Charms and it feels like Christmas every day. And so I try to make it a point to go in there. But in gratitude, I really try to be grateful every day, and I write gratitude. But every Tuesday, because we're on a 4-day work week, Every Tuesday it's actually every Monday. I send out, it's called Hanrahan's High Five, and I recognize 5 positive practices. I call people by name, and I specifically recognize something that they did during the week. I also try to put that on our social media page because I think it's important to highlight the good. And so I really take intentional efforts to stay in the positive because the work is hard. It's easy to get bogged down, But so, yeah, I think gratitude and just remembering to have joy here at school and outside of work, modeling that for the staff.
Yeah. Oh, such important things to think about. Thank you for sharing that. I want to shift just a little bit and talk about where risk shows up or where it can hide. And I want to ask you, where do you see the most risk outside of core class time? I mean, there's bus routes and there's gymnasiums and fields and parking lots and late night events. So can you talk a little bit about where that risk is living? And then any advice you have about small changes that can give you a big return on the safety of the building and the students inside?
Sure. I think one thing is making sure that your building is secure, like every day doing a perimeter check. I think, and it's tedious. One school I worked at had like 100 doors. It was a monster high school. But our rural buildings, our buildings in rural districts are oftentimes older and aged. And so they bring things like water leaks. Sometimes we get snakes in the building, unfortunately, or other critters. So we have to be, I think doing perimeter checks regularly and walking your building and looking at the ceiling tiles, looking to see if there's a door that's broken, looking to see if the windows are closed all the way. And it takes time, but I think that's really important. I also think those, your check-in and check-out procedures need to be tight. And, I believe in the building, there's only one place you can check in and there's one place you can check out. And in rural communities, there's sometimes this sense of familiarity that almost lulls us into lowering security, and that's dangerous. So making sure that when you have visitors, they have on that visitor sticker, they have permission to be in the building, and then training. And I had somebody on a staff that I worked with, they were mad. A visitor was mad because my staff member stopped them and interrogated them why they were there because they didn't have on a badge. And I said, I understand your feelings, but that's exactly what I've trained them to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then when it go wrong, one place I worked, we found out that a parent was let in the building by a student. And this parent walked all over our building for like 5 minutes and no one stopped them for 5 full minutes. So I had to sit down with the staff. I called an emergency staff meeting. I was like, look, this is what happened and this is how we'll move forward. This is what I need you to do. And like just being honest with your staff and stuff like that's happened because they'll help you fix it if you tell them. But yeah, those perimeter checks, how people get in and out of the building, and then troubleshooting with your faculty when something goes off the rails. Because we're human, people make mistakes.
Yeah, definitely. So when there is a crisis event of any kind, there's an understanding that seconds matter and that words matter. And so I want to talk a little bit about the communication component of it. And when you have an unfolding situation, whether it's things that are inside the building, on the campus, at a bus stop, how do you or how have you seen others keep internal communications disciplined and external communications clear?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And some districts that are super effective with this, they have designated people who will be responsible for communication when like a bus accident happens, or there's a communication tree when there's a weather crisis of some kind, like a storm or flooding. So I think setting up those structures of communication on the front end, and so that everybody knows their role and everybody knows, who will be responsible for carrying the message. I know that one rural district here in our state, they had a custodian attempt to shot up a van that was on campus because he was mad at the maintenance director. Thankfully, the maintenance director wasn't in that. But what happened is when all law enforcement got on the campus, the district had their own law enforcement. And then you had outside agencies, and it was like this whole traffic jam of who's in charge here and who's communicating out to the media, who's communicating to the community and the teachers. So I think on the front end, doing some planning when there's those kind of crises, but also on the inside of your building, I think building strong teams. We have a structure in my building with our grade chairs. And when I want to communicate something out or I want to follow up on something, like if something happened in the building, I use that group. And they're the people that carry the message for me. They help me with that.
Yeah. Very important to have everybody knowing what their responsibilities are. And I think a lot of that is professional development, but it's also making sure that you're running drills. And you talked a little bit about that already, but Alyssa, can you talk about how leaders should think about designing and messaging drills so that they create muscle memory, which is what they're designed to do, but they also do it without causing fear in students or in staff?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think, there are the regular drills that really don't cause people much anxiety, the severe weather drill. We have the monthly fire drills in my state. But some of the other drills, I've been part of lockdowns when I was a high school administrator, and they bring in dogs and sniff. And one thing they did in that district that I thought was effective, they immediately had a statement that went out via email to the media and on social media platforms. We had a lockdown at X school. And if something was found, they were right up front. We found X, Y, and Z, and it has been handled over to law enforcement, or we didn't. I think that's really important. And then the other thing is doing an after action report. So when we've done, we had an intruder drill, and we do that with regularity. And if something was off, or there was a breakdown in communication, or somebody's part wasn't done effectively, even if a fire drill took too long, doing an after action meeting, having an after action report with action steps about what we'll do next time, and making sure there's a shared understanding about that. I think that's important. You got to break that thing down like a math problem if you want a different outcome.
Yeah, very important. One of the things that superintendents that I've spoken to, and really for me too, when I was a superintendent, reunification is usually something that's just a massive undertaking. And there's a lot of moving parts to that. Can you talk a little bit about what your reunification plan looks like with line flow and handling not on the list situations, or making sure that you're communicating boundaries, even in the moment where empathy is really required, but it's easy to say something that's a little forceful just so that you can keep things moving? How do you structure those reunification plans?
Well, in some districts, again, it's that front end planning, and they have it. This person's responsible for communicating with parents. This person's responsible for crowd control. And even this person is responsible for technology, because in one place I worked, there was a gun found on campus. They had to evacuate the whole building, and we brought our laptops, and we have a line. We have this whole system flow for families to reunite with their children. And then computers start dying. Nobody has a charger. Nobody has backup. And so that was like a whole after action step 2. But I think, again, on the front end, making sure there's clarity around roles, making sure everyone knows where to go, that you have a traffic flow with parents, you have crowd control, but then you have communication. You have your counselors on hand to just recognize the panic, but also be that calm hand that can kind of guide people through a process and procedure to get their child. And then regular updates. I think it's important when things happen and you have to evacuate a building, really having a shared understanding at your school and at the district of who's going to communicate what to families and how often, so that people know that something's been addressed, but then there's periodic updates. I think that's really important too. But the reunification, it takes so much more than just who's going to call the 9th grade parents. There's so many pieces to that.
Yeah, they are massive undertakings. I don't think people realize how much of a heavy lift those things are. So you talked a little bit about technology with that, and you mentioned aging facilities, and we were lucky enough with ESSER dollars across the country to be able to do a lot of upgrades, whether it was with facilities or tech upgrades. And now things are a little bit different with the monies that we have to be able to do that. So we really have to be intentional about how we spend every safety dollar that we're allotted. So can you talk a little bit about facility or tech upgrades that might give leaders in rural communities the biggest bang for their safety dollar, whether it's entry control or camera placement or door hardware, those kinds of things that just really might be important for people to think about?
Yeah, so I'm going to revert back when I worked with the rural team at the State Department here in Georgia. One of my tasks was, creating a grant from the ESSER dollars where rural districts could apply to get money for safety upgrades. And one thing we saw a lot that we thought is the cameras. I mean, and now that I'm an administrator, really having cameras at every possible hallway, on the exterior and perimeter of your building, that is huge. I think also one of the things that people employed I think that leaders should employ, our state has actually mandated it in the last legislative session because we had the Appalachia shooting in our state, unfortunately. They created legislation where every school employee has to have a panic button. And I thought that was very forward thinking. I think having a system to alert that there is a crisis, even if your state doesn't mandate that, but having some kind of system, to let people know, like, there's an intruder on campus, or there's a major crisis here, or there's, a gun in a classroom. Mm-hmm. I think anything you can do to invest in that. And then I'll go back to mental health. People are now investing. I think leaders can invest in anything because the mental health and that prevention on the front end can prevent a school shooting. And while it's important to invest in hardware like metal detectors and cameras, I think it's also important to, invest in making sure that we know what a mental health challenge looks like, and if someone's a threat to themselves or others, and then making sure that there are things in place to help them get what they need in terms of help. Yeah,
definitely. We do all of these things to make sure that we have a safer campus. And at the end of the day, you have to really assess, are you or are you not? And so can you talk a little bit about what indicators tell you that a culture or that a building is safer, whether it's, response times or surveys or better attendance? And can you share how you give that information with staff in the community in a way that makes them feel more comfortable about the safety of the school building itself?
Yes. So I want to make sure the question is like, what are markers of a safe school culture? Of course, the staff morale is important. I mean, are people smiling? Do people want to come to work? But also, like, do you see people laughing and joking with each other? Are teachers eating together at lunch? Are children, getting together in groups? Like, how much joy are you spotting in the building during the day? I think when children want to be a part of the school community and that they have regular attendance, I think it makes the school safer for sure. So I guess I say all that to say, how is the leader promoting the sense of belonging in the building? Are there intentional efforts to do that with your staff so that every voice is heard and appreciated, with your parents? And sometimes that's tough.
Yeah.
Especially now they have all these avenues, to communicate their thoughts and feelings, but also the staff and the children, making sure that everybody's voice is heard to support, a school safety, but also like that continuous improvement. Mm-hmm. And then publicizing the good that goes on. I think, and I try to regularly communicate with our school council, with parents. I try to share data all the time. These are the things that we're working on. These are the things that where we've shown improvement. But I really think relationships it boils down to relationships. If the relationships in the building are good and not toxic, but properly boundaried, I think you'll have a safe school where everybody knows and understands what their role is to support the learning and the whole child. I think that you have a safe school.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it. Thank you for that. Alyssa, what are the emerging trends or risks that are on your radar, whether they're social media-driven conflicts or fentanyl, vaping? Those are issues. Cyber threats are something we're seeing more and more of. Staffing shortages, weather. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you could pick. But what are those things that really leaders are paying attention to, and how are they, or should they be thinking about preparing their schools now so they're not caught flat-footed later?
Yes, I think AI, of course, is a wonderful tool and something most of us have grown to love and use with regularity. But an emerging trend that I hear our leaders talking about, as being the lead learners in our buildings, is using it with fidelity and teaching kids to be critical consumers. Because, if you think in the past, teachers were the general repository for all information. Well, it's not like that anymore. And so really, of course, we want students to master content, but we want them to be critical thinkers. We want them to be innovators, problem solvers. And we want to give our voice. There's a greater emphasis on leveraging student voice to support school improvement. A lot of people have talked about developing a system and process, at least the leaders that I've talked to. In our state, literacy has been a big initiative, and superintendents in the state who've seen the most gains have really leveraged student and community voice, as well as the voice of their teachers, to sustain some of the gains that were needed. I will say again, the mental health. I have the mental health of our staff and our children. I've talked a lot about children's mental health, but the staff, I've seen some elevated instances where staff had some deep struggles with their mental health and substance abuse post-COVID. And, the work that we do is tough. I mean, teaching is very hard. Education's hard, but there's been a greater attention given to mental health, I think, for students and staff. We're having conversation in our state, teacher retention. If you don't have good teacher retention, of course, that can be a threat to safety, and we're talking in my state about improving the classified staff's pay. That is something that has been overlooked. We talk about teacher pay, but our classified staff, really improving their pay and improving that parent-to-teacher pipeline. When people feel a part of your building, they'll stay. And when you can sustain the people that you have and grow them, it makes for a safer community, but when there's a lot of turnover, it's hard to build that sense of community and that positive school culture. So leaders in my state, we're talking a lot about building innovative ways to build the teacher pipeline, using our classified staff as almost like these sources to build upon. And then the mental health of the adults in the building. I know that there's just been unprecedented levels of people just, struggling with their mental health, the grown-ups.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that that's where we are, but I am so glad that there are leaders like you that understand that and are responding to that. So that's a good thing. So, I always end with a question, and that is, what does the term rural advantage mean to you?
Gosh. Rural advantage. Rural communities are gold mines. I work in one, and it's the exact reason why I returned to the school level work. When you live in a rural community, everything you need, if you build the right relationships and the right structures and you build trust, you can really do a lot for students without having a lot of layers to work through. And there's just people in rural communities have grit, they're tenacious, And when the community is for you, they're for you. When you win a parent over, you won them over for the rest of the child's career most of the time. But there is magic in these small communities. People in rural schools know how to do a lot with a little. And they know, they know how to get the things they need. They know how to get people in place that will help them. And I have missed it. So the rural advantages, while we're small and limited, that's also our superpower, I think.
I love that answer. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Well, and thank you also for opening the doors to how safety really can become a habit and not just a plan that sits on a shelf, and really for the steady practical wisdom that you're sharing both from Chattooga as well as from across the state of Georgia. Thanks for spending some time with me.
Sure.
And for those of you that are listening, if this conversation gave you something useful, please like this episode and subscribe to The Rural Scoop and share it with a colleague who's revising their plan this month. Your ratings and comments help other leaders find us, and I read all of them. So if you want to keep the conversation going, feel free to connect with me here on social media, LinkedIn. Tell me what you're trying and what's working and where you might need a thought partner. Remember, in rural leadership, our strength really is our shared story. When we lead together, we thrive together. I'm your host, Melissa Sadorf, and I will see you next time.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Rural Scoop. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep these important rural conversations going. And we'd love to hear from you, so feel free to leave a comment or share your thoughts. You can follow along and never miss a new release by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform or by following us on social. We're on YouTube at The Rural Scoop, Instagram at msadorf1, and X at msadorf03. The Rural Scoop is produced with support from Vela Educational Consultants. To learn more, visit velaconsultants.com. See you next time for more great discussions about rural education. And as always, keep leaning in to the rural advantage.